The morning light streaming through the dusty windows of the probate office cast long shadows across the worn carpet as Emma Rodriguez clutched the small wooden jewelry box in her lap. It felt lighter than air, practically weightless, and when she'd shaken it gently that morning, nothing had rattled inside. Her cousin Derek sat across from her, drumming his manicured fingers on the armrest of his chair, while Aunt Caroline paced behind them, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum with increasing irritation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma had always known her grandmother Rosa's estate wouldn't amount to much. The old woman had lived modestly in her tiny apartment above the bakery she'd run for 40 years, surviving on Social Security and the small income from renting out the commercial space below after she'd finally retired. But when the estate attorney, Mrs. Chen, had handed Emma the jewelry box with a knowing smile and mentioned it needed to be appraised for insurance purposes before the estate could be fully settled, something in her expression had made Emma's heart skip. Emma had been the only grandchild who'd bothered to learn Spanish just to talk with Abuela Rosa in her native tongue. Every Saturday for 15 years, she'd taken 2 buses across the city to spend the day helping with inventory, cleaning the bakery equipment, and listening to stories about the old country. Derek, meanwhile, had visited maybe twice a year, usually when he needed money for his latest get-rich-quick scheme, or when his mother dragged him along for Christmas dinner. The appointment with the insurance appraiser had been Derek's idea, naturally. He'd insisted that everything in the estate needed to be properly valued, claiming it was only fair to all parties involved. Emma suspected he was hoping to find something valuable that could be sold to pad the modest inheritance they were splitting. The jewelry box, after all, was the only item that hadn't been specifically mentioned in Rosa's will, listed simply as, quote, personal effects to be distributed among family. When Marcus Thompson, the certified appraiser, arrived at the probate office that Tuesday morning, Emma immediately noticed how his eyes lingered on the jewelry box. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a worn leather briefcase that suggested decades of experience. Derek had perked up the moment Marcus walked in, probably calculating potential dollar signs in his head. Marcus set up his workspace methodically, laying out various tools and instruments on the conference table with practiced precision. He pulled on cotton gloves and held out his hands for the jewelry box, which Emma reluctantly surrendered. The appraiser's expression remained neutral as he examined the exterior, running his fingers along the carved wooden surface and checking the brass hinges with a magnifying glass. The box itself was nothing spectacular to look at, Emma had always thought. Made of what appeared to be simple cherry wood, it measured about 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep, with modest brass hardware that had tarnished with age. The only decorative element was a small inlaid pattern on the lid, a series of geometric shapes that Rosa had once told Emma represented mountains from her childhood village in Guatemala. Derek leaned forward in his chair as Marcus opened the lid, revealing the faded burgundy velvet interior that Emma had seen hundreds of times before. Empty compartments stared back at them, their small dividers designed to hold rings, earrings, and necklaces that had long since been sold or given away over the years. Rosa had often mentioned during her final months that she'd already distributed most of her jewelry to family members, keeping only her wedding ring, which she'd been buried with. Marcus, however, seemed far more interested in the box than its contents or lack thereof. He lifted it carefully, examining the bottom with his magnifying glass before setting it down and reaching for a small digital scale from his briefcase. When he placed the jewelry box on the scale, his eyebrows raised slightly at the reading. He made a note in his leather-bound notebook, then picked up what looked like a small electronic device with a metal probe. Emma watched nervously as the appraiser continued his examination, wondering if Derek's insistence on having everything valued was about to backfire. Maybe the box was worth less than they'd thought. Maybe it would cost more to appraise than it was actually worth. She'd been prepared to simply keep it as a memento, one of the few tangible connections she had left to her grandmother's memory. The tension in the room was palpable, as Marcus worked in methodical silence, occasionally making notes or adjusting his instruments. Caroline had stopped pacing and was now standing directly behind Derek's chair, both of them watching the appraiser's every move with undisguised interest. Emma found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't quite say why. Marcus Thompson's fingers traced along the bottom edge of the jewelry box with surgical precision, his electronic device emitting a soft beeping sound that made Derek shift uncomfortably in his seat. The appraiser's weathered face remained impassive, but Emma caught the subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd discovered something significant. Without explanation, Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew a different instrument, something that looked like a small flashlight with a purple lens. When he switched on the device and held it over the jewelry box, Emma gasped audibly. Under the ultraviolet light, faint markings became visible along the interior walls of the box, markings that were completely invisible under normal lighting. The symbols appeared to be numbers and letters, arranged in what looked like a coded sequence. Derek practically launched himself out of his chair, craning his neck to get a better view, while Caroline pressed closer, her earlier irritation replaced by naked curiosity. Marcus made several more notes before switching off the UV light and setting it aside. He then produced a small digital camera and began photographing the box from multiple angles, paying particular attention to areas that had shown the hidden markings. The clicking of the camera shutter filled the otherwise silent room, each sound seeming to amplify the growing tension among the family members. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process what she'd just witnessed. Her grandmother had never mentioned anything about hidden markings or codes in the jewelry box. Rosa had always been straightforward about her possessions, often telling Emma exactly where important documents were kept, or which items held sentimental value. The idea that she'd been keeping a secret all these years seemed completely out of character for the woman who'd raised Emma to value honesty above all else. After completing his photographic documentation, Marcus carefully lifted the jewelry box and turned it upside down, revealing the bottom panel. Using a thin metal tool that resembled a letter opener, he gently probed along the edges of the wooden base. Emma heard a soft click, and suddenly a small section of the bottom slid away, revealing a hidden compartment that none of them had known existed. Caroline let out a sharp intake of breath, while Derek muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse mixed with excitement. Emma felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Marcus reached into the secret compartment with a pair of tweezers and extracted what appeared to be a small, tightly folded piece of paper. The document was yellowed with age and had been wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth to protect it from moisture and deterioration. The appraiser handled the paper with extreme care, unfolding it slowly on the conference table, while Derek and Caroline crowded closer. Emma remained frozen in her chair, suddenly afraid of what they might discover. The paper appeared to be some kind of certificate or official document, written in Spanish with several official-looking seals and signatures. Marcus studied it through his magnifying glass before looking up at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite read. Caroline was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp with impatience. She demanded to know what the document said, what it meant, and why Rosa had hidden it in such an elaborate way. Derek echoed her questions, adding his own theories about potential financial value and wondering aloud whether they should contact a lawyer immediately. Emma found herself wishing she could disappear, overwhelmed by the sudden intensity of her relative's attention. Marcus reached for his smartphone and began typing rapidly, occasionally pausing to examine the document more closely. He explained that he needed to verify certain details before he could provide a complete assessment, but the preliminary indicators suggested they were dealing with something far more significant than a simple jewelry box. The hidden compartment construction alone indicated sophisticated craftsmanship, and the document appeared to be authentic based on the paper quality and aging patterns. While Marcus continued his research, Derek had moved to stand directly behind Emma's chair, his presence making her skin crawl. He began talking rapidly about how they needed to handle this discovery carefully, how they should probably get a second opinion, and how important it was that they all work together as a family to maximize whatever opportunity this represented. His tone had shifted from the casual disinterest he'd shown earlier to something much more predatory and calculating. Caroline joined in, suddenly treating Emma with a warmth that felt completely artificial. She talked about how proud Rosa would be that her granddaughter was there to witness this moment, how fitting it was that Emma had been the one to inherit the jewelry box, and how they should all celebrate this unexpected gift together. The dramatic change in both their attitudes made Emma's stomach turn, and she began to understand why her grandmother might have hidden something so carefully. Marcus looked up from his phone with a grave expression, and Emma knew instinctively that whatever he was about to reveal would change everything. The appraiser cleared his throat and announced that he needed to make some phone calls to colleagues who specialized in historical documents. But based on his preliminary research, they might be looking at something with considerable historical and monetary value. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Derek's rapid breathing and Caroline's nervous finger-tapping against the table. Marcus stepped outside the probate office to make his calls, leaving Emma alone with Derek and Caroline, who had transformed into completely different people within the span of 20 minutes. Caroline perched on the edge of the conference table, speaking in the syrupy tone she typically reserved for her wealthy clients at the real estate firm, explaining how complex inheritance situations required careful family cooperation. Derek had positioned himself near the door, presumably to ensure Marcus wouldn't leave without providing more information, but his constant glancing toward the jewelry box made his real priorities obvious. Emma stared at the document still lying open on the table, the Spanish text swimming before her eyes as she tried to process the sudden shift in atmosphere. She recognized some of the words from her conversations with Rosa, but the formal legal language was beyond her comprehension. What she did understand was the way her relatives were now looking at her, their expressions mixing false warmth with barely concealed calculation. The same people who'd shown minimal interest in Rosa's funeral arrangements were suddenly deeply concerned about family unity and proper estate management. When Marcus returned 15 minutes later, his expression had grown even more serious. He sat down across from Emma and carefully repositioned the document under his. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Magnifying glass before speaking. According to his colleagues at the International Antiquities Authentication Bureau, the paper appeared to be a land grant certificate issued by the Guatemalan government in 1943. The document officially transferred ownership of a significant coffee plantation from the departing German colonists to Rosa's family during World War II, when properties belonging to Axis nationals were being redistributed. Derek's eyes widened visibly as Marcus continued explaining the historical context. Many German families had established coffee plantations in Guatemala during the early 1900s, but when Guatemala declared war on Germany in 1941, these properties were seized and often given to local families who had demonstrated loyalty to the Allied cause. Rosa's father had apparently been instrumental in providing intelligence about German activities in the region, earning his family this substantial reward from a grateful government. Caroline interrupted with rapid-fire questions about current property values and potential development opportunities, but Marcus held up a hand to indicate he wasn't finished. The appraiser opened his laptop and showed them satellite images he'd obtained from a contact at the Guatemalan Ministry of Agriculture. The plantation, located in the highlands near Antigua, encompassed nearly 200 acres of prime coffee-growing terrain. More importantly, recent geological surveys had identified significant mineral deposits beneath the property, making it potentially valuable for mining operations as well as agricultural use. Emma felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. Her grandmother had been sitting on what could potentially be worth millions of dollars, living modestly in her small apartment while working 12-hour days at the bakery. The sacrifice and struggle that had defined Rosa's entire American experience suddenly took on a different meaning, and Emma wondered how many nights her grandmother had lain awake thinking about the property she'd left behind. Marcus explained that verifying the current legal status would require extensive research through Guatemalan government records, but preliminary inquiries suggested the land had remained in Rosa's family name all these years. Property taxes had been minimal, paid annually through a local attorney who'd apparently been handling Rosa's affairs without the family's knowledge. The lawyer, now elderly himself, had been attempting to contact Rosa for the past several months about increased interest from international development companies. Derek was already on his phone, presumably calling his attorney, while Caroline had moved to stand directly behind Emma's chair. She placed her hands on Emma's shoulders in what was meant to appear as a supportive gesture, but her grip felt more like a claim of ownership. Caroline began talking about how overwhelming this must be for Emma, how she'd need experienced guidance to navigate such complex international legal matters, and how fortunate it was that she had family members with business expertise to help her through the process. The transformation in their behavior would have been comical if it hadn't been so transparently predatory. These were the same people who'd questioned every small expense from Rosa's funeral, who'd suggested Emma was being overly sentimental about keeping mementos, and who'd barely concealed their impatience during the estate settlement process. Now they were speaking as if they'd always been a close, collaborative family unit dedicated to Emma's well-being and success. Marcus gathered his equipment methodically, explaining that he'd need several days to complete his research and provide a comprehensive valuation report. He recommended that Emma consider consulting with an international property attorney and suggested she might want to contact the Guatemalan consulate to understand her rights as an inherited property owner. The appraiser's tone remained professionally neutral, but Emma caught the meaningful look he gave her when he mentioned the importance of making these decisions independently. As they prepared to leave the probate office, Derek positioned himself between Emma and the exit, blocking her path while he launched into an elaborate speech about family loyalty and shared responsibility. He reminded her that Rosa had always valued family unity above personal gain, and suggested that any major decisions about the property should involve input from all family members. Caroline joined in, emphasizing how isolated Emma might feel trying to handle international legal matters alone, and how much easier everything would be if they approached it as a team. Emma clutched the jewelry box tighter, the weight of it feeling different now that she understood what it represented. The hidden compartment had contained more than just a document. It held the key to understanding why Rosa had worked so hard for so many years, why she'd been so careful with money, and why she'd always seemed to carry the weight of unfinished business on her shoulders. The realization that her grandmother had been protecting this secret, perhaps waiting for the right moment to reveal it, made Emma feel both honored and terrified by the responsibility now resting in her hands. Emma returned to her cramped studio apartment that evening, with the jewelry box secured in a small lockbox Marcus had provided, her mind reeling from the day's revelations. She'd managed to extract herself from Derek and Caroline's increasingly aggressive suggestions about family meetings and shared decision-making, but not before they'd made it clear they expected to be included in every aspect of whatever came next. The ride home on the subway had been a blur of anxious thoughts about international law, property rights, and the growing certainty that her relatives would not simply accept being excluded from what could be a life-changing windfall. As she sat at her kitchen table examining the document under her desk lamp, Emma noticed something Marcus hadn't mentioned during his evaluation. Along the bottom margin of the certificate, written in Rosa's distinctive handwriting, were several phone numbers and what appeared to be names written in both Spanish and English. One entry caught her attention immediately. Eduardo Morales, Abogado, Guatemala City, followed by a local phone number and the notation trustworthy, handles property matters. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, calculating the time difference between New York and Guatemala City. It was late, but not unreasonably so, and something told her that waiting until morning might give Derek and Caroline too much time to formulate their own plans. She dialed the number, half expecting to reach a disconnected line or an automated message, but after 3 rings, a warm male voice answered in accented English. Eduardo Morales turned out to be the son of the lawyer who had originally handled Rosa's affairs, having inherited both his father's practice and his commitment to the Rodriguez family. When Emma identified herself as Rosa's granddaughter, she could hear the genuine pleasure in his voice as he expressed his condolences and explained how he'd been trying to reach Rosa for months. The elderly attorney spoke fondly of Rosa's father, describing him as a hero who had risked his life to provide crucial intelligence during the war, and explaining how the land grant had been a well-deserved reward for his courage and patriotism. The current situation, Eduardo explained, was both complicated and promising. The coffee plantation had indeed remained in Rosa's name all these years, with minimal taxes paid through his father's firm and later through his own practice. Recent geological surveys commissioned by multinational mining companies had revealed substantial copper and silver deposits beneath the property, leading to numerous inquiries about potential purchase or development partnerships. However, Eduardo had been unable to proceed with any negotiations without proper authorization from Rosa or her designated heir. More importantly, Eduardo revealed information that Marcus's research had not uncovered. Rosa had been in regular correspondence with his office for the past 5 years, updating her will to ensure the property would pass directly to Emma while bypassing other family members entirely. She had been specific in her instructions that Derek and Caroline were not to be informed about the plantation's existence until after her death, and only then if Emma chose to share the information. Rosa had apparently anticipated exactly the kind of family conflict that was now brewing. When Emma asked about the property's current value, Eduardo's estimate made her dizzy. Conservative appraisals suggested the land alone was worth approximately $3 million, based on agricultural potential and location. However, if the mineral rights were developed through partnership with established mining operations, the total value could reach anywhere from $15 to $25 million over the next decade. The numbers seemed surreal to someone who had been stretching every paycheck to cover rent on her tiny apartment. Eduardo also had practical advice about Emma's immediate situation. He strongly recommended that she not discuss the property's value with other family members until she had proper legal representation in the United States and a clear understanding of her rights under both American and Guatemalan law. He explained that inheritance disputes involving international property often became extremely complicated, especially when multiple parties claimed interest in the estate. Rosa's foresight in explicitly excluding Derek and Caroline from the property inheritance would be crucial if they attempted to challenge her decisions legally. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Eduardo provided Emma with contacts for reputable international property attorneys in New York and explained the process for establishing her legal ownership of the plantation. He also shared stories about Rosa's father that she had never heard, painting a picture of a man who had risked everything to fight against fascism and protect his community. The land grant wasn't just a valuable inheritance. It represented her family's legacy of courage and principle, making Derek and Caroline's grasping behavior seem even more distasteful. After hanging up with Eduardo, Emma sat in her quiet apartment, contemplating the magnitude of what she'd learned. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and text messages from Derek and Caroline, each one more insistent than the last about the need for immediate family consultation and shared decision-making. She'd ignored them all, but their persistence suggested they were already formulating plans that probably didn't include respecting her rights as the sole inheritor of the property. Emma opened the jewelry box once more, running her fingers along the edges of the hidden compartment that had concealed such an extraordinary secret. Rosa had trusted her with this inheritance for reasons that went far beyond simple family affection. Her grandmother had observed Derek and Caroline's characters over the years, had seen their selfishness and sense of entitlement, and had made deliberate choices to protect both the property and Emma's future from their influence. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but Emma began to understand that honoring Rosa's trust meant more than just claiming legal ownership of distant land. It meant having the courage to stand up to family members who would try to manipulate and pressure her into sharing what was rightfully hers alone. 3 days later, Emma sat in the Manhattan office of Patricia Lawson, one of the international property attorneys Eduardo had recommended, with copies of all the relevant documents spread across the polished conference table. Patricia had spent the morning reviewing Rosa's will, the land grant certificate, and correspondence from the Guatemalan law firm, nodding approvingly at the thoroughness of Rosa's planning. The attorney confirmed what Eduardo had told Emma: the property inheritance was legally airtight, with no legitimate avenue for Derek or Caroline to challenge Rosa's decisions. However, Patricia warned that legal correctness wouldn't necessarily prevent Emma's relatives from making the process difficult and expensive. She explained that family members often filed frivolous lawsuits in inheritance disputes, hoping to pressure the rightful heir into settling out of court rather than enduring lengthy legal battles. The attorney recommended that Emma be prepared for escalating pressure tactics and suggested they send formal cease-and-desist letters if Derek and Caroline continued their harassment campaign. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma's phone began ringing with Derek's contact information displayed on the screen. She'd been avoiding his calls for days, But Patricia encouraged her to answer and put the call on speaker so they could both hear whatever new strategy he'd devised. Derek's voice filled the conference room, syrupy with false concern, as he expressed worry about Emma's well-being and suggested she might be making hasty decisions without proper family support. Emma surprised herself with the steadiness of her own voice as she informed Derek that she was currently meeting with an international property attorney and had already established contact with legal representation in Guatemala. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Derek's tone shifted dramatically. His voice became sharp and demanding as he insisted that any decisions about international property needed to involve the entire family, and that Emma's secretive behavior was disrespectful to Rosa's memory. Patricia gestured for Emma to remain calm and took control of the conversation, identifying herself as Emma's legal counsel and explaining that Rosa's will had been crystal clear about the property inheritance. The attorney's professional tone carried an unmistakable note of authority, as she informed Derek that further attempts to pressure or manipulate Emma could be construed as harassment and might result in legal action. Derek's blustery response about family loyalty and shared responsibility fell flat against Patricia's matter-of-fact recitation of property law and inheritance rights. After hanging up, Patricia observed that Derek's reaction had been entirely predictable and suggested they could expect even more aggressive tactics in the coming days. She recommended that Emma document all contact attempts from her relatives and consider changing her phone number if the harassment escalated. The attorney also suggested that Emma might want to take a brief trip to Guatemala to inspect the property personally and meet with Eduardo's firm, both to establish her ownership presence and to remove herself from Derek and Caroline's immediate reach, while the legal boundaries were being established. 2 weeks later, Emma stood on the terrace of a small hotel in Antigua, looking out over rolling hills covered with coffee plants that belonged to her. The flight to Guatemala had been her first time leaving the United States, and the experience of seeing her family's property had been overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. Eduardo had met her at the airport and spent 3 days showing her around the plantation, introducing her to the local managers who had been maintaining the property for decades, and explaining the various development opportunities that mining companies were proposing. The land was even more beautiful than the satellite images had suggested, with the coffee plants arranged in neat terraced rows along the mountainside, and a small village nearby where many of the workers' families lived. Emma had been struck by how different this legacy felt from the cramped urban environment where she'd grown up. The plantation represented not just financial security but a connection to her family's history and values that Derek and Caroline's grasping behavior had tried to corrupt. Eduardo had also arranged meetings with representatives from 3 different mining companies, each presenting proposals for development partnerships that would allow Emma to retain ownership while receiving substantial royalty payments from mineral extraction. The most conservative estimate suggested she could expect annual income of over $2 million once operations began, with the potential for much higher returns if commodity prices remained strong. The numbers still felt surreal, but Emma was beginning to understand that her grandmother's gift was about more than money. On her final day in Guatemala, Emma visited the cemetery where Rosa's parents were buried, placing flowers on their graves and silently thanking them for the courage that had made her inheritance possible. She thought about Rosa working endless hours at the bakery, never mentioning the fortune she was protecting for her granddaughter's future. The sacrifice and secrecy suddenly made perfect sense. Rosa had been ensuring that Emma would have choices and opportunities that she herself had never enjoyed. When Emma returned to New York, she found 17 voicemails from Derek and Caroline, each one more desperate and accusatory than the last. They had apparently hired their own attorney and were threatening to challenge Rosa's mental competency at the time she updated her will. Patricia reviewed their threats with obvious amusement, pointing out that they had no evidence of incompetency, and that Rosa's careful planning actually demonstrated remarkable clarity and foresight. 6 months later, Emma quit her job at the accounting firm and enrolled in an MBA program focusing on international business development. The coffee plantation was generating steady income through its agricultural operations, while she decided whether to pursue mining partnerships. She'd purchased a comfortable apartment near Central Park and established a scholarship fund at the community college where she'd earned her degree, naming it in Rosa's honor. Derek and Caroline had eventually given up their legal threats when their attorney explained the futility of challenging such a well-documented inheritance. They occasionally sent birthday cards with passive-aggressive messages about family unity, but Emma had learned to delete their communications without reading them. She'd found peace in understanding that Rosa's final gift hadn't just been financial security, but the freedom to choose her own family based on love and respect rather than obligation and manipulation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.